In the name of God, who was and is to come. Amen. Jesus said, I am the Good Shepherd. This past week, one of All Saints' faithful parishioners stopped by the office with a gift for the church. It's a beautiful framed photograph of two panels from a stained glass window. One of the panels depicts Jesus as a shepherd, holding a shepherd's crook in one hand while he cradles a lamb in the other hand. The other panel contains a flock of sheep. If you spent any time in churches with stained glass windows, you've probably seen some version of the window that I've just described. The Good Shepherd is one of the most popular themes in stained glass art. It's easy to understand why. The Bible is full of stories and images of sheep and shepherds because there were plenty of both of them in ancient Palestine. They were so familiar that biblical writers talked about the relationship of sheep and shepherds in several different ways. In parables, for example, or as the archetype of the relationship between God and God's people. The parable of the lost sheep, the story that Jesus tells of a shepherd leaving 99 other sheep while he searches for one sheep who has strayed, comes immediately to mind. Which of you, Jesus said, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? Jesus says that God is like that, searching for anyone who feels estranged or separated from God in any way. And then there's the 23rd Psalm, where the shepherd makes us lie down in green pastures, leads us beside still waters, and revives our souls. No wonder so many of us know the 23rd Psalm by heart and can recite it even when we can't quote any other passage from the Bible at all. On the fourth Sunday of Easter this year and every year, the theme is of God as a shepherd. We always read the 23rd Psalm, and the gospel always comes from the 10th chapter of the Gospel according to John, where Jesus spends the entire chapter teaching about shepherds and sheep. I can't begin to count all of the Good Shepherd sermons that I've preached over the 40-plus years that I've been ordained. And, like many of you, I'm sure, I've been comforted again and again during difficult times in my own life by Jesus the Good Shepherd, who has sought me out and has found me. But Jesus is saying something more to us this morning, and if we're to hear the full message of the gospel passage, we need to hear about that something more today. You see, the 10th chapter of John's gospel isn't just about some simple bucolic scene. It isn't just about a pastoral vista with sheep grazing and shepherds tending them. Instead, it's an extended discourse on the whole subject of leadership. The discourse takes place during an argument between Jesus and those who were in power in Jerusalem. To understand what Jesus is saying, we need to know something about the Old Testament background to this chapter, because it's this background that lies behind what Jesus is really saying when he says that he is the Good Shepherd. The most important background for this passage from John's Gospel comes from the prophet Ezekiel. When Ezekiel talks about shepherds, he uses the word shepherd as a metaphor for ruler, for the kings and the nobles and the high priests of Israel, those who had the power to act and who held the responsibility for the welfare of God's people. In the 34th chapter of Ezekiel, God denounces the rulers who have not cared for the people of Israel, those he calls the flock. These bad shepherds have plundered the flock. They have neglected the weak, the sick, and the straying. So Ezekiel hears God saying, "The sheep were scattered because there was no shepherd, And because they were scattered and unprotected, they became food for all the wild animals. God goes on to say, "My sheep were scattered over the face of the earth, with no one to search or seek for them." It's a grim vision of what happens to people when leaders are more concerned for themselves than for the well-being of the people that they are supposed to care about. God then goes on in the passage to issue a promise to the shepherds and to the flock. God promises that the flock will be taken away from the wicked shepherds and that God will become their shepherd instead. "I shall lead them out of the nations and gather them from the countries. I shall feed them with good pasture. I myself shall be the shepherd of my sheep. I shall seek the lost." So we can see a good deal of what Jesus says about shepherding in John's gospel reflects these verses from Ezekiel. When Jesus declares himself to be the good shepherd, he is claiming to be more than just a good pastor. He is claiming to be the good leader of his people, the good king, the good shepherd, as opposed to all the bad shepherds who take what they want for themselves and leave the flock in shambles. "You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the sheep," Ezekiel writes about the bad shepherds of Israel. "You have not strengthened the weak, you have not healed the sick, you have not bound up the injured, you have not brought back the strayed, you have not sought the lost." By contrast, Jesus says he is willing to do anything for the welfare of the sheep, even to lay down his life for them. The something more in today's gospel passage is about leadership and about the stark difference between good leaders and bad leaders. Some of you may know the name Ron Heifetz. He's the founding director of the Center of Public Leadership at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and he's authored many books and articles on the whole subject of leadership. The last chapter of his book, Leadership on the Line, is called Sacred Heart, and I want to tell you a story from that chapter. In the chapter, Heifetz and his co-author, Marty Linsky, talk about a visit that Heifetz made to an old English church on the afternoon of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Heifetz and his wife Susan wandered into the church after he had finished a speaking engagement at Oxford, and Ron Heifetz sat down in front, a Jew in an Anglican church facing the cross. Weeks before, Heifetz and his wife had attended a Jewish workshop on deep ecumenism, where the idea of Sacred Heart was explained as a reflection of God's promise not to keep us out of the fire and water, but to be with us in the fire and the water. Heifetz looked up at the image of Jesus, this man being tortured for his beliefs, a frightening sight for anyone, but especially for a Jew who was conscious of the history of the persecution of Jews by the followers of Jesus. Heifetz began to wonder what Rosh Hashanah might have been like for Jesus in his own lifetime. He reports that he said to Jesus, "You were one of our teachers. Why not keep us company in the new year? Nobody else is here to celebrate with us." Heifetz stared at Jesus and he meditated. "Reb Jesus, will you tell me your experience on the cross? This is Rosh Hashanah, when we contemplate Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac. Will you please give me a message?" After about 10 minutes, Heifetz got very excited. He asked Susan to come with him, taking her out into the churchyard. He asked her to lie down with him beneath an enormous old pine tree and to stretch out her arms, spread-eagled. The two of them lay there, outstretched for several minutes. "How do you feel?" Ron asked Susan. "Really vulnerable," she said. "Me too," said Ron. And that's the message about the Sacred Heart, the willingness to feel everything, to feel as Jesus felt the gravest doubt, forsaken and betrayed near the moment of death. My God, why have you forsaken me?" But in nearly the same instant, to feel compassion. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Heifetz realized that Jesus, the Good Shepherd, remained open. This, for Heifetz, was the antidote to the cynical, arrogant, and callous leaders that hurt and damage the people they're responsible for leading. Jesus talked about bad leaders this way: "A hired hand does not care for the sheep. I lay down my life for the sheep." True leadership, being a good shepherd, is about being vulnerable and giving one's self away. Now, you may wonder why all this talk about leadership this morning. And you may even be saying to yourself, "This leadership stuff really doesn't apply to me. I'm not a leader, at least not in any major way." Some members of All Saints community certainly are leaders, both in this church and in the wider community. But for everyone else who thinks you aren't a leader, don't be so sure. Whether you consider yourself a leader or not, I want to talk about one way every person at All Saints can be a good shepherd during these next important weeks and months. What I'm talking about is a key aspect of the culture of this parish church, and it's this: holding one-on-one meetings with each other. All Saints is an effective and powerful congregation because you value and tend relationships. And holding regular one-on-one meetings is how this happens. For years, one of the key practices of this church has been holding one-on-one meetings with each other. Some of you at All Saints are incredibly good at holding individual meetings to listen to other people, to get to know who other people are. You see, meeting with another person says to that person, you have values, ideas, dreams, plans, lessons, and insights that are well worth listening to. Now, I know it's been hard to have one-on-one meetings during the pandemic, but things are starting to change now. Restrictions are lifting, and spring is slowly, reluctantly returning to Chicago. Yes, the parish directory, planned for publication in June, will help reconnect us, but nothing can take the place of our getting to know one another through one-on-one meetings. The time devoted to them is more important than time spent on any other conventional church activity. And don't be afraid if this one-on-one meeting business involves new behavior for you. There's help and training available. To be a follower of the Good Shepherd means to be good shepherds ourselves sometimes. It requires that we keep our arms outstretched and open, that we be vulnerable, full of God's compassion and love for each other. So, think about someone in this congregation that you might like to get to know, and then schedule a time for a one-on-one conversation with them. If you don't have that person's contact information, the staff can certainly help get it to you. This basic, old-fashioned practice is by far the most important, effective, and least employed organizational tool that's used in congregations today. If you meet with another person one-on-one, you'll be glad you did. And All Saints will certainly be stronger because you did. Amen.